Tonight on The American Experience. He was just a 14-year-old farm kid from Utah who had a radical vision. It was called television. But this lone inventor would spend the rest of his life in a battle against corporate giants, in a race to hold on to his big dream, small screen. Tonight on The American Experience. Major funding for the American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century. By the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And the annual financial support of viewers like you.
And by Miracle Grow Plant Foods. For flowers, for vegetables, for a beautiful show, for lawns and for shrubs. Whatever you grow, a gardener's true friend is Miracle Grow.
Good evening and welcome to the American Experience. I'm David McCullough. Who was Philo T. Farnsworth? If you're drawing a blank, that's understandable. He's not exactly a household word. There's no familiar product bearing his name, no place on the map, not a Farnsworth Institute or university, or even passing mention of him in the usual history books, though there should be all of that. Philo Farnsworth effected change so profound and far-reaching that we're still incapable of knowing the half of it. For his was the genius that transformed electrons into visual images. His was the genius that gave birth to television. And it is a story so compelling, so very American, as to seem the stuff of myth. Like Abraham Lincoln, he was born in a log cabin. Like such other American giants of science and invention as Franklin, Edison, the Wright brothers, he sprang from the most obscure beginnings and without formal training. He was an American original, brilliant, idealistic, undaunted by obstacles, and so steadfast in the faith that nothing was impossible that others of like spirit gladly risked everything out of faith in him. Jimmy Stewart would have been perfect in the part, and particularly in the inevitable showdown with the corporate juggernaut of the day, RCA. In a now famous lecture in praise of patent laws, Abraham Lincoln spoke of the importance of protecting and encouraging the fire of genius in the discovery and production of new and useful things. Once having seen tonight's film about the fire of genius as manifested in one 20th century farm boy, I doubt that any of us will ever again have trouble with the question, who was Philo T. Farnsworth?
While plowing a field in 1921, a 14-year-old Mormon boy named Philo T. Farnsworth began to think about an idea that would change the world. He wanted to send pictures over the air, like sound over radio. As the story goes, he had a vision in a potato field. He looked down at the tracks left by his disc harrow and imagined tiny electrons creating a similar picture, line by line. His epiphany in the field inspired him to invent the first working electronic television, a feat that most engineers at the time thought was impossible. This is the kind of legend that usually guarantees an inventor worldwide fame and fortune, yet the name Philo T. Farnsworth has long been forgotten.
Now, we're not going to identify this contestant panel. We will call him simply Dr. X. Now, Doctor, if you will whisper your secret to me, we will show it at the same time to the folks out there. All right? to help to classify Dr. X's secret, I'll tell you it concerns something that he did, and we'll start with Bill Cullen, please.
Do doctors use this object? Is this some kind of a machine that might be painful when it's used?
Yeah, sometimes it's most painful.
You're a wise man.
Are you a dentist? No, not a dentist.
No one knew who Philo Farnsworth was. People in the industry knew, particularly the older people that are actually around when he was demonstrating television in 1930. When I was a kid, it was in the 40s. There wasn't any television happening, so you said my father was an inventor and invented television. People would say, that's nice. What is it?
This is Dr. Philo T. Farnsworth, who invented electronic television.
I suppose you could say that he felt he had created kind of a monster, a way for people to waste a lot of their lives.
Doctor, truthfully, are you sorry?
No, I'm not.
Well, it's up to you.
I asked him the same question. He said sometimes. He said sometimes.
Through my childhood, his reaction to television was, there's nothing on it worthwhile, and we're not going to watch it in this household, and I don't want it in your diet, your intellectual diet.
Unfortunately, television being what it is, it's your baby, and we're out of time. So here are your Winston, sir, the money that you won, and our eternal gratitude. I'd be out of work if it weren't for you. Thank you very much.
He was out there all alone all the time, and had been since the time he was a child. I mean, can you imagine being a child and hearing about all these things and then thinking about them and then getting ideas and starting to work them out and learning how to put them into mathematical terms and not having anyone to really talk with about it? I just visualize him as being more and more and more and more alone intellectually, reaching a point where it never even occurred to him that there might be other people who could think at the same level that he did.
Philo was born in a log cabin in Indian Creek, Utah in 1906. The oldest of 5 children, he was soon put in charge of his younger sisters, Laura and Agnes.
Did you say there was an old picture of me in here somewhere?
Yes, I think so. It's near the front. It's pretty good, too.
Oh. We always lived in remote areas.
In a log cabin.
In a log cabin with no...
We calcimined it.
with no modern facilities. And so he had no... really was never exposed to any of these ideas.
The family were Mormon settlers who eked out a living in Utah's barren valleys. They were always loading their wagons in search of better land.
Papa was born before the railroad came to Utah, and he had the pioneer spirit. He was hunting for good soil. We used to move so much that we used to say that every time we harnessed a horse, the chickens laid down to have their legs tied just automatically because we were going to move again.
Eventually, when Philo was 12, the family settled on a small ranch in the Snake River Valley of Idaho. At their new home, Philo found unexpected treasure. Hidden in the attic were stacks of science and radio magazines. His imagination was fired by Einstein and Marconi and the fantasies of science fiction writers. In 1919, the future was approaching fast, and Philo was out there, trying to join in. For the first time in his life, there was electricity on the ranch, so he began devising new gadgets to hook up to the power generator.
Philo had the job of pushing the handle for the hand-operated washing machine, And he decided that his time was too precious. He rewound an armature, which is a very difficult thing to do. And he made a motor and attached it to his mother's washing machine and made it run so that he didn't have to push the handle all the time.
We had quite a few children around, and Phil had a habit of lining us all up and showing us how electricity travels. He would shock somebody at one end, and then we'd touch each other, and that electricity would go right down the line. And it was tickling, but it was not seriously. It wasn't going to hurt us, but we were a little bit afraid of what he was going to do. Phil would just build the future for us. He would just tell us all the things that we were going to have. We were going to have a car. We were going to have a refrigerator that ran.
An indoor bathroom.
Yeah. We were going to have all these things that eventually we did get. But Phil knew what was going to happen years and years ahead. And of course, he was going to invent. He decided he was going to be an inventor.
As a child, his heroes were Edison and Bell, the pioneers of a new frontier. Sending messages down wires or across airwaves was familiar to most children, but Philo was curious about the next challenge, a new idea called television. Converting moving images into electrical signals was a much tougher proposition. Crude mechanical devices using rotating discs produced the first flickering pictures. But even at the age of 14, it was obvious to Philo that this technology was doomed. Philo realized there was a more elegant approach to the problem. If he could harness electrons, those tiny particles that travel at the speed of light, it might be possible to reproduce much better pictures with no moving parts. His electronic vision was far too complicated to share with his friends. But one day, he tried it out on his science teacher after school.
He amazed his teacher by drawing on a blackboard a long series of diagrams and explaining that he'd been reading about some mechanical system that people were working on in the East that involved a spinning wheel, and that would never work in the long run, and it could be done with electrons. And he knew it could be done, and this is the way he thought it might be done.
His idea was to have a camera which would focus light onto a light-sensitive surface that would emit a stream of electrons. The ingenious part of his device divided the picture up into lines of light and shade that could be read like words on a page. A rapidly changing electromagnetic field would scan the picture line by line. The electrons collected at the far end of the camera tube would then form a stream of electric pulses that would be transmitted over the airwaves to an antenna. Inside the receiver, the pulses would be converted back into a series of lines, and the picture reconstituted on the television screen. This 14-year-old had the blueprint for an electronic television system. Unknown to Phil Farnsworth, there were other inventors working on the same problem. On the other side of the country, a Russian emigre had recently arrived in New York. Vladimir Zworykin was well ahead with his plans to produce electronic television and would become a formidable rival.
Zworykin was very different from Farnsworth. He had a PhD in electrical engineering. When he was still in Russia before the revolution, he was studying under someone who was already doing work on the cathode ray tube, one of the key elements of television. So he came to this country highly trained, having already worked in a very sophisticated technology, and was working at Westinghouse. This is a very different situation to use as a launching pad than a farm in Idaho.
Phil started college in Utah, but his education ended at 18 when his father died. To support his family, he took a job delivering radios for a furniture store in Salt Lake City. Radio was becoming increasingly popular across America, but in Utah, it was still a novelty. On weekends, he borrowed radios and organized parties so his friends could hear the new stations. As he flicked across the wave bands, one young girl became intrigued by Philo.
He had very expressive, deep blue eyes, and he looked every bit the Eagle Scout that he was. But the thing that really drew us together was music. He sort of liked the syncopated type music. He was very difficult to follow. And this may have been why I got more of his dances, because I could follow him. And we really had a good time. We danced and learned new steps all the way home on the sidewalk.
By 1925, Philo was impatient to realize his plans for electronic vision. He described his idea for television to two small-time California businessmen, George Everson and Les Gorell. He assured them it was going to be bigger than radio, and they believed him. They agreed to invest $6,000 so he could build a prototype.
He's a 19-year-old boy doing all this. The force of his personality must have been absolutely incredible to achieve this. He convinced them to back him with what was, in effect, their life savings. It was $5,000 that Everson had saved up, and this was his rainy day money, and Gorell actually had to promise money. He had nothing to put in. So their entire life savings go into the story told by this 19-year-old boy who transformed himself before their eyes into a visionary.
He could foretell just what television was going to do for the world. Make the world a smaller place, because we could watch what other people's lives were like, and they, in turn, could watch us. And, of course, as he said when he gave me my engagement ring, was that he didn't want me to be ashamed of it when we were rich, and we would be rich.
Phil was ready to leave Utah to realize his dreams in California, and he persuaded Pem to accompany him. She got her first taste of his obsession as she lay alone in bed on her wedding night.
Phil had to go see the people who were putting up the first money, and he was gone for a long time. And I went through all kinds of fantasies as to what could possibly be keeping him this long. So finally, when he came, he said, Pem, I have to tell you, there's another woman in my life. Well, before I could faint, he said, and her name is television. And the only way I can see that we'll have as much time together as I'd like us to have is if you work with me. How about it?
The newlyweds left Salt Lake City for Los Angeles in 1926. Philo was 19, Pem 18, and the future of television lay before them.
We were two green kids from the country, movie struck. We just loved movies. And when they would have an opening, the searchlights would be all over the sky. And of course, we got there ahead of time so that we joined the throngs that were watching these movie greats come in with their jewels and furs and top hats and tails and all this.
In a small house in Hollywood, they set up a makeshift laboratory in their dining room. Les and George were eager to help the Farnsworths prepare for their first experiments.
They were out in the backyard working for him, winding the magnetic coils, and working on the dining room table. They put together the components. They were running around town, buying things, scrounging things. They became his assistants, his disciples. It was all just a family coming together to work as a unit of Philo Farnsworth's vision.
There were no ready-made optical or electrical components. Everything had to be assembled from scratch. Les and George found a glassblower to start making a vacuum tube for the television camera. After 3 months of round-the-clock effort, Farnsworth was ready to try out his first camera tube.
Les and George were all there for the big occasion, and Phil stood back and pushed the button and turned it on, and bang, everything went up. The power surge had come through, just starting the generator up, had blown the whole shebang, the tube and everything. Well, Phil's face was ashen, and I could just see what was going in his mind. Les said, "Well, heck, Phil, it's not the end of the world."
At the flick of a switch, he was back to square one. George Everson went to San Francisco in search of more capital. He packed Phil off to a tailor to smarten himself up. This time, the 19-year-old kid would have to dazzle hard-nosed bankers with his electronic vision.
One of them had said that it was a damn fool idea, but someone should put some money in it. And they decided that they would put up $25,000, and Phil said, "If you do that, I will have you a picture within a year." Anyone with any engineering experience at all would have called that a crazy thing to say, because actually he ran into a lot more blank walls than he thought he would.
Phil Farnsworth seemed oblivious to the magnitude of his plan. He had to build a camera tube which would turn an image into a stream of electrons, and a television tube that could turn a stream of electrons back into a picture. Many had talked about electronic television, but to actually build a working system was a daunting task. In a converted second-floor loft, he gathered an enthusiastic band of family and friends around him. Phil's energy was contagious. You didn't work for Farnsworth, you worked with him, as Rom Rutherford discovered.
Phil's office was always open. You could always go in and ask him anything you wanted to. He was always looking for the best, and he tried to bring out the best in you. I don't doubt for 1 minute that he was a genius. I mean, to me, he just personified that, because he, everything he would get on, but he could stay on something. In other words, this was his thing. If he got an idea, he wanted to follow it clear on down to the minutest detail.
As the ideas poured off the page, the circuits became more and more complex. Early on, it was hard going to produce an image in the first prototype camera tubes.
The point was there was nothing you could get off the shelf. I can remember machining up some things that may take you 3 hours to get a piece of metal down to the right thickness, but if that's what you needed, that's what you did.
They found out I was useful for more than sweeping floors and cleaning windows, because they taught me to use the precision spot welder for making tube elements. And then I did the drawings in Phil's journals. I told him his handmade sketches were much better than my drawings. And he says, "Well, we're all just learning, you know, you get better."
Each day's progress was meticulously recorded. These notebooks would be his only protection when the patent battles began. Over on the East Coast, Farnsworth's rival Zworykin was struggling. His early efforts to produce electronic television were treated with barely disguised scorn by the Westinghouse research chiefs.
because he had been doing these experiments and asked for a chance to carry them on, they let him do it, although they felt very dimly about it. And when he performed his first demonstrations in the 1920s, many of the people of the Westinghouse people who watched thought it was hopeless, you see. And so the mechanical system of television continued to be used while these visionaries carried on.
Throughout the late 20s, mechanical television still seemed like the safe option for investors. The images may have been crude shadows on a wall, but they attracted enormous public interest. When the first television drama, The Queen's Messenger, was broadcast, the actors had no need to fear recognition in the streets. And over at the BBC in London, John Logie Baird was demonstrating his success with spinning discs.
This apparatus was shown to members of the Royal Institution and others on January 27, 1926, and showed true television images in light and shade for the first time. This is the scanning disc with its lenses. This is the second disc by which the light is further divided and passes into the light cell.
The picture was barely visible, but at least they had an image. Farnsworth's financiers were starting to get impatient.
At night, when he would come home, we would feel this tension, this terrible tension that he was under. He had promised them, as he stood in front of these bankers, that he would have something to show them in a year.
He was very optimistic, very optimistic.
On September 7th, 1927, Farnsworth got a signal. The first all-electronic transmission of television was a straight line. It would be another year before he had something more encouraging to show his investors.
The backers were so eager to see some return for their money that Phil decided to play a trick on them. So he invited them to the lab and got them in the room where the broadcast would be received, and they had drawn on a piece of paper a $sign. And as they were sitting eager to receive this picture, on came this $sign, and this was his way of telling them that they would get their money back. And so that was when this Mr. Gorell, who was one of the backers, said, "The damn thing works."
The image was only the size of a postage stamp, but it was an amazing achievement. When news of his triumph broke, Hollywood moguls and movie stars like Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks flocked to meet the man who might challenge cinema.
For his first press conference, things really looked better because it went all over the world. It was a big thing, you know. It's the first time anyone had ever transmitted an all-electronic transmission of television.